Shalom and welcome to Life Lessons. Today we are the 12th segment, and this parasha, this section, is called VAYECHI. And we are concluding today the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit. And the next one is going to start the whole new book of Exodus. But the name of this section is called VAYECHI. VAYECHI in Hebrew, the translation means, and he lived. Who lived? Jacob. So here we're coming to the conclusion of the history of the forefathers and the foremothers. The next book is talking about the children and how they went through, what happened to them, the Exodus, the suffering in Egypt. But right now, we're coming to the end of the story of Jacob, that this concludes the story of Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. And in this process is also the discussion about Jacob's son, Joseph. So the first thing is, in this section is going to talk about the passing of Jacob. But the name of the section is called, and Jacob lived. So many commentators ask this question: if it's talking about the passing of Jacob, why is the name of this section, and he lived? In Judaism, we say that the name of a section is the name of the entire parsha. In other words, all the chapters associated in this section are named VAYECHI. So it means that everything in this section is speaking about the life of Jacob. In this section also discusses a very interesting request of Jacob to his son Joseph. At this time, Joseph is the viceroy of Egypt. He's the ruler. So he has all the power as long as Pharaoh lets him. So we read here, just before the passing of Jacob, he calls over his son with a very important request. And he says to him, I would like that when the day comes, that you should bury me back into Israel. Make sure you do not bury me here in Egypt. Not only that he asks him, do me a favor, but he also says to him, swear to me. The expression is here, put your hands beneath my thigh. This was the expression of taking a note. So he's not relying just on Joseph saying, yes, Daddy, I'm going to do that. And there's no question that Jacob would have trusted Joseph if he would have said, I'm going to do it. But Jacob wasn't satisfied with a promise of Joseph. He needed him to swear. Swear to me that this is what you're going to do. And it says here in verse 31 on chapter 47, and he said to him, please swear to me, and he swore to him. Okay. Interesting enough that in this parasha, as we say, in this section, when Jacob passes on, Joseph sends a message. The verses here are quite interesting, that Joseph does not approach Pharaoh directly. From reading the verses, you could see there's a little hesitation, that Joseph is not so sure how Pharaoh is going to deal with the situation, that he's now going to take a break and travel to Israel to bury his father. We could only, if we could put ourselves in Pharaoh's mind, that's a little bit hard sometimes. What is he thinking? But it's possible that Pharaoh is maybe thinking that, they're going to all go and they're not going to come back. And we know that later on Pharaoh turned out to be not such a nice guy. So it's very possible that right now what he's doing is out of necessity, that he needs Joseph's there to be there, to help him out in ruling the country, because he's not managing by himself, as we saw before. When it came to the hunger years, he needed Joseph there. So Joseph sends a message, and he says, please give this over to Pharaoh. My father made me swear that when I pass on, you should take me to Israel and bury me in the grave that I prepared for myself. If you look very carefully here, when Jacob is speaking to Joseph, he says, do not bury me in Egypt because I want to be in my parents' plot. My parents in the cave of the Machpelah in Hebron, that's where Abraham is and Sarah, this is where Yitzchok and Rebekah, this is where Leah is. I want to be there with them. That's not what he says to Pharaoh. He says to Pharaoh, because my father asked me to be buried in the place that he prepared. Well, this is interesting. And please give me permission to go. Pharaoh feels he has to be nice. He says, yes, you could go. But the verse, and it's verse 7 in chapter 50 says very clear, Joseph went to bury his father and all his brothers and the families. However, Pharaoh sent with them the elders from his house and the elders of Egypt. This is clearly to make sure that Joseph has no other ideas to settle in Israel, but that he's coming back. Not only this, it says that Joseph and his brother and his household went. However, the children and the cattle and the sheep stayed. So there's some guarantee that they're staying there. Okay. They go, huge funeral as describes over here, come back. The last few verses of this chapter and the end of this section speaks about the passing now of Joseph. And here is something very interesting. Because what did we see in the beginning? That Jacob requested from Joseph, when my time comes, please take me to Israel. So that's telling Joseph how important it is to be buried in Israel, in his parents' plot, or as we saw, what he told Pharaoh, what he prepared himself. Here turns Joseph, and there's, by the way, an interesting part here of a great reconciliation here, because after Jacob passed away, the brothers are afraid that now he's going to take revenge of what they did to him. And they send a message, and they tell Joseph, and this is one of the places where we find that maybe for the sake of peace, you don't have to be so truthful. It's a discussion by itself. But here they tell him, your father said before he passed away, please ask Joseph to forgive your brothers. Now, Jacob never said that, because Jacob never thought for a second that he's going to want to do anything to them. But they're so afraid, so when they come back, they send a message. And the verse says, and when the messenger came and he said that to Joseph, Joseph cried. He cried when he heard these words. And he also said to them, what do you think? I am instead of God? What you taught may be bad about me, but God has done it for good. Look what's happening in this country and in this world. Because of me becoming the viceroy, you were able to save the country. So don't be afraid. I have any bad thoughts about you. And he consoled them, spoke unto their heart, it says. But towards the end here, here's Joseph. It says he's about 110 years old. He sees grandchildren and he's all excited about it. But then the last verse it says, Joseph turns to his brothers and he says, I'm about to pass on. And God is going to remember you and take you out from this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he swears them by saying these words, Pakod ifkod, God will surely remember. These words, God will surely remember, is going to become very important because later on in Exodus, when God tells Moses to take the Jews out, he's going to use these words. Go tell the Jewish people, God has remembered you. And when he came and he said that, says those are the words that Joseph used. And these are exactly the same words. Well, anyways, here Joseph also asks his brothers, he made them swear. Now, you would think will be the same idea. I pass on, do me a favor, take me, bury me in Israel, together with my father, our father. That's not what happened here. What happens here, he says, he swore them and he says, God is for sure going to remember you. And then when that day comes, please take me out from here when the day comes. In other words, they should bury him temporarily in Egypt while they all there. But when they come out, they should take his coffin with them to bury it in Israel. And then it says, Joseph passed away, and these are the last words of this section. Vayisem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, he was placed into a coffin in Egypt. Just as a point of history, so we should know that later on, by the Exodus, the verse says very clearly, this is in the beginning of Parshat B'Shalach, by the splitting, where it talks about the splitting of the Red Sea. They came out of Egypt. The verse tells us, and Moshe took with him the bones of Joseph. Moshe himself, he's the leader, he himself, as everyone is leaving, everyone is taking their belongings, and and they have the dough with them that they're running out, doesn't have enough time to rise. What is Moshe thinking? About the coffin of Joseph. Because he remembered that. And it says over here the same words. Because he had sworn the Jewish people and he told them, God will remember you and please take my bones out of here. And this is exactly what Moshe is doing. And for 40 years in the desert, the coffin of Joseph is with them. And when they went into Israel, in the town of Shechem, that this is what some call Nablus, but it's really Shechem, that's where the tomb of Joseph is still today. Unfortunately, not completely in the control of the Jewish people. But we won't go into it now. Anyways, when we conclude a section, when we conclude a whole book, because we have the 5 books, Bereshit, that this is Genesis, in the synagogue, this is what we do. Everyone rises and they say 3 words. Chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong, and may we be strengthened. This is how we finish every book. It is not written in the Torah, in the scroll itself, but it's there in the printed books, and everyone rises and says it, and the reader of the Torah repeats it. There is a rule, and the rule is that any time when you give a speech or there is a section in the Torah, they will always try to finish on a positive note, not on negative. And if we find something negative, there's always a discussion. Why did they finish in a negative statement? And always the answer must be that there's something positive here. It's not just negative. So the question that becomes here is, how do we end the last verse of the whole book of Genesis? And he was placed into a coffin in Egypt. In Judaism, we know that this is what life is all about, that unfortunately, a time comes and an individual has to go to a coffin. However, if we want to talk about positive, that's not how we would finish it. Maybe we'd finish about the accomplishment of Joseph, or what he made everyone swear that God will take you out of here. Why finish the last words and he was placed in a coffin with idea of death, and more than that, in a coffin in Egypt, that he wasn't buried right away in Israel. Where this goes back to what we started with, there's a big contrast here between the request of the father and what Joseph is doing. The father comes and requests and says, please take me out of here. I don't want to be buried here. And Joseph says, I will stay with you guys as long as you are all here. Okay? The question, so that's the question that we have. What is the contrast between father and son, Jacob and Joseph? But to bring this in, to understand that, there's another interesting part over here that will help us to understand. When Jacob was sick and is about to pass on, he called over his son and the two grandchildren, Manasseh and Ephraim, and there's a whole talk that he gave to his son. One of the things that he told him, he says, and you should know that on the way, while I was still on the road, your mother passed away, your mother Rachel. And you know, I buried her right there on the way. This was known as Bethlehem in Bethlehem. So Jacob did not take her to the cave. It's Leah that was buried there, but Rachel is buried what we know outside of Jerusalem in Bethlehem, that till today is still there, known as the tomb of Rachel, Kever Rachel. Why is he telling him all this? The Rashi and all the commentators point out a very interesting point that comes up as we think about what's going on here. Here, Jacob asked him, do me a favor when my day comes. Take me out, don't leave me here. So Joseph is thinking to himself, and how come you didn't do this to my mother, to your wife? And Rachel was very dear to Jacob. So how come he didn't take the extra effort to take her to Hebron? Excuses, there's a lot of excuses and there's a lot of answers. He was with a lot of kids then, and it wasn't so simple. But then Joseph could be thinking to himself, you are now in Egypt, and that's quite far away, especially in those days, from Hebron, and you are asking me to do something that maybe Pharaoh is not going to be so happy, it's not going to be so easy to do, and you want me to swear, and I swore that I will bury you in Egypt. But how come when it came to your dear wife, my mother Rachel, you didn't do that? So Rashi goes and he explains us and he tells us a very important story in our history that Jacob was revealing to Joseph, and that will help us a little bit to understand about the whole story here. He tells him as follows. He says, I know that it's not always going to be good times in Israel. There's going to be times where you are the rulers of the country, but there's going to be a time where you're going to be exiled. So you're going to be in Israel, and then the Babylonians are going to come and going to exile you. On the way to Babylon, there's going to be a spot where when the Jewish people are exiled from Jerusalem, they'll have a spot where they could cry their heart out and beg God for help. And you know what that spot is? The tomb of Rachel. So it says, I wanted to take Rachel back to the cave of Machpelah, because that's where Abraham is, that's where Isaac is, this is where Sarah is, Rebecca, this is where Adam and Eve is, quite of a holy place. However, by divine revelation, with a clear message from God, he said to me, you need to bury here Rachel, because she is what we call in Yiddish, the Yiddish mama, the Jewish mother that will cry for the pain of her children when everyone will stop there on the way of exile. So that's why she needs to be there. So she needs to be close by right there. What did Joseph learn from that whole story? A very important point. That in every situation that we find ourselves, there has to be a combination of two things. You've got someone from inside that knows the situation and prays for that situation. But then there's also another point where you need somebody above the problem, above the challenges, that is looking above all the problems and could help out. So to help out a situation, you need from within and you need from outside. Use many times the example, because the Talmud uses a statement and says, Ein chavush matir atzmo mi beit ha'asurim. Somebody that is in jail cannot free themselves. And we've seen here in America, sometimes it could be the greatest lawyers on earth, but if they are stuck in jail, they're going to need to get some other lawyer to be able to take them out. And we've seen that in quite a few times. So when a person is stuck in a situation, as of a genius they could be, not necessarily they'll be able to solve it. You're going to need someone from outside to do it. You could be the best driver, but if you got stuck in the mud with even the best truck possible, but sometimes you're going to need to have another truck come and pull you out. So in every situation, there's those two things, from inside and then from outside. This is the combination here of Jacob and Joseph. Jacob feels in order to pray for the Jewish people, for his descendant, and to be their support, he needs to be above all the problems. So therefore, take me to the Machpelah. That's where I should be buried, because I feel I'll be able to fulfill my job much better over there when I am with Avram and Isaac in that place, and pray all the time that the Jews should be able to come out of Egypt and all the future problems. But from the story that Jacob told Joseph about placing his mother outside of Jerusalem, Joseph was able to learn that he could not ask such a question, that he has to be the one with them. Jacob is sending them a statement. You should know that Egypt is not your place. You need to know that you need to go back to Israel. So all the time the aspiration is, that's not where we're going. But then at the same time, but how do we survive in the places of all challenges? Is by knowing we have a great person with us. Who? The coffin of Joseph. So they both creating together, solving the problem in a joint way, but very interesting. Jacob is buried in Israel, but Joseph says, and that's why it concludes not in a negative statement, that is a very positive statement, that while they are in Egypt, where is Joseph? In a coffin in Egypt. Because he protects them and he helps them and gives them survival, because he reminds them that even in Egypt he was able to be strong and not to give in to anything. And in a way, that is the important lesson to us, that in whatever situation we find ourselves, we have to know we have these two things. We have our history. We have all our great giants, that they're the ones that are protecting us and praying for us. But at the same time, we ourselves need to do something for it. So we have our great people with us at the same time, our current teacher, our current rabbis to help us out while we are here till the Mashiach comes. So this is a joint effort. Our great-grandparents and us, our great teachers from the previous generation, and then us, and together we combine to a very good team that should help us to be very good people and serving humanity at best. Thank you.